This week, we talk about the various mythologies related to the solar eclipse and the importance of the Mason to study the 7 liberal arts and sciences as to bring the truth forward and dispel darkness and spread light. Then, in a third in a series of articles from Worshipful Brother Patrick Day, we talk about how the work of symbols, or even Masonic symbols, tend to play tricks on us, and how the human mind finds correlations between things that look similar, but we're forced to ask ourselves, in the search for truth, are these things the same? And more often than not, there are more differences than similarities, leaving us with the proverbial foot in our mouth, if we're trying to be honest. All this and more. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back to the show. This is episode number 634. I want to thank our producers, fellows, contributors, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. Without you, we don't make this show. It just can't happen. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for your contributions. And if you're curious on how you can help the WCY podcast, head on over to WCYpodcast.com, click on support the show, and check out the various options. In the news, want to give a pin update. Those are being produced as we speak and should be on their way to me shortly and then on the way to you. So if you have purchased a producer's pin, or maybe you're owed one for becoming a producer of the WCY podcast, then you will get the brand new awesome WCY lapel pin. As far as presentations go, the next couple will be the April 29th, which will be a virtual presentation for Ontario Masons. I'll be speaking on the philosophy of kings, Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch and the Royal Art. What's that all about? Well, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche has changed the world, and his approach to individual responsibility and the progress of humanity was stark and uncomforting at times. His idea of a perfected man, the Übermensch, can almost be seen as a blasphemous thing within religious circles, but similarly, making oneself better through experience and perspective is exactly what Freemasonry calls us to do and is in simpatico with religious viewpoints. So in this lecture, we'll explore these concepts and their interrelations. If that interests you, then I would urge you to reach out to the organizers of that particular lecture, which is Brother Craig DeRocco, who is the DDGM District 13 for the Grand Lodge of BC, or British Columbia, and Yukon. The first piece I had this week was something I wanted to read last week, but we had a couple of episodes that were recorded in advance. So this is called Understanding Solar Eclipses and comes from the Midnight Freemasons blog and is by Brother Jim Stapleton. Brother Jim Stapleton is the senior warden of the USS New Jersey Lodge number 62. He's also a member of the New Jersey Lodge of Masonic Research and Education number 1786. Jim received the Distinguished White Apron Award from the Grand Lodge of New Jersey, and he was awarded the Daniel Carter Beard Masonic Scouter Award. Jim is also a member of the Society of King Solomon. Now, a couple of weeks ago, when the big solar eclipse happened on April 8th, the Masonic Roundtable did an excellent rundown of solar eclipses and various interesting, almost conspiracy theories and facts regarding solar eclipses because of the general conspiratorial hay fever or paranoia that happened during this lead-up. As usually all things that go that direction, nothing happened aside from the solar eclipse, which was absolutely awesome. So here we go. Understanding Solar Eclipses by Midnight Freemason contributor Jim Stapleton. A total solar eclipse is set to occur on April 8th, 2024, and will impact a wide swath of North America. It is estimated that more than 40 million Americans will be in the path of the eclipse. Excitement is certainly building for the event. Locations in the exact path of the total eclipse are bracing for increased tourism crowds. There are plans underway for activities such as watch parties, live online viewing programs, and There are even special airline flights that will follow the path of the eclipse. The interest in the event is understandable. After all, the next time a solar eclipse will impact a large area of North America won't be until 2045. However, humans have not always been excited about observing celestial occurrences like eclipses. Since ancient times, people have looked to the skies and studied the heavens. They observed the way the moon changed shape and traveled across the night sky. Patterns were recognized amongst the stars that resembled people and animals, which led the ancients to describe them as constellations, along with accompanying stories. Though one of the most terrifying and awe-inspiring phenomena that ancient civilizations observed had to have been a solar eclipse. The sun has long held a place of extreme importance in many cultures throughout the course of history. They believed that the sun possessed incredible power. It provided warmth, was vital for agriculture, and aided navigation. The sun is so powerful that it can cause eye damage and potentially blindness if gazed upon directly. As a result, the ancient cultures believed the sun held supernatural powers. Quote-unquote, it was regularly worshipped as a god, Amun-Ra to the Egyptians, and the Helios to the Greeks, or as the goddess, such as Amaterasu for the Japanese, and Soleil for the many Baltic cultures. When the solar eclipses occurred, earlier civilizations thought they were bad omens. Since they lacked scientific understanding, they invented explanations for the sudden disappearance of the sun during an eclipse. Some of the oldest records of solar eclipses are from ancient China. The Chinese emperors feared that solar eclipses were signs from heaven, that the stability of their power might be in danger. So there was tremendous emphasis on recording and predicting solar eclipses. The people of ancient China believed that a celestial dragon devoured the sun when the light was dispersed. It became a custom to try and scare away the dragon during eclipses by banging drums and making loud noises. Since eclipses are temporary, it is easy to see how people could assume that their interventions had an impact when the sunlight eventually returned. In Hindu mythology, it was believed that the serpent god Rahu Ketu wanted to devour the sun. To prevent this from happening, Vishnu cut off his head. However, this did not solve the problem. The head, Rahu, still wanted to catch the sun and the moon. Sometimes he would successfully catch them, causing an eclipse. Though, with his head no longer attached to his body, the captured sun and moon would eventually fall out of his neck. The Vikings believed that Skoll and Hati, two giant wolves, would chase the sun and moon, trying to devour them. Eventually, Hati would catch up with the sun and consume it. When an eclipse would happen, the Vikings holler and make loud noises to scare Hati away. Interestingly, it seems that various ancient cultures believed that some sort of deity or mythological creature was responsible for eclipses. Of course, we have an understanding of the cause of such planetary phenomena in modern times. By utilizing geometry, astronomers can precisely predict where and when eclipses will happen. As Masons, we are taught to study the liberal arts and sciences, so we should make sure we learn about the science behind astronomical events, which leads to a better understanding of the universe. Jim Stapleton. Many thanks for that, Brother Jim. There is so much misinformation, and you kind of see some of the more wild claims that prevail even in modern day all over social media, that some tie back to some of these ideas of doomsday and all of these other things. You know, the antagonist has changed, but the modicum of approach is the same, the solar eclipse. And as a Freemason, you are told to study those 7 liberal arts and sciences, so I hope you enjoyed. The next piece I have for you this week is part of a series that was written by Worshipful Brother Patrick Day. While the titles of these pieces don't always line up in the way that they are related in parts, they are nonetheless part of a series. Part 1 of the series was published back on December 20th, 2023, and it was called What Even Are Symbols? Now, the second part in the series came out in February of 2024, and it was titled, Are the So-Called Higher Degrees Actually Symbolic or Sorcery? And it was part 2 of that series. That particular reading and the article that it was read from did receive a number of interesting comments, which not all were kind. But I think it stems from the understanding of what's being examined in a historical and contextual way. That is to say, what these symbols and things that were written about meant in the day that they were written, which, most people might think, wow, if something is written and it sounds plain as day and it was written in the 1700s, doesn't that mean the same thing today? And interestingly enough, it just doesn't. Words have changed their meaning and what they stand for over time, and that's nothing new, and it matters. So today we're going to read the third part of the series, and it's called Lightning Strike, or How Symbols Play Tricks on Us. And again, part 3 of the series. Lightning Strike, or How Symbols Play Tricks on Us, part 3 of a series by Worshipful Brother Patrick Day. Very often in esoteric Masonic research papers and books, you will find instances of Masons relating Freemasonry back to some ancient mystery cult or another. They will take the few artifacts and written accounts, if there are any, of these cults and spin them into something that resembles Freemasonry. Such writings were barely acceptable in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but this really is no longer acceptable, at least academically. Their agenda appears to be that they want Freemasonry to be the inheritors of an ancient lineage of initiation rite. Albert Pike does this, Albert Mackey does this, Manly P. Hall does this. It would be nauseating to survey every Masonic author who is guilty of such parallelomania, the phenomenon of someone seeing similarities between two or more religions or cultures, in which they begin to force more similarities than are really there, sometimes completely fabricating information to push their agenda of making these things appear similar. In many instances, they suggest that all the ancient mystery cults were the same thing, with only minor variations from region to region. Such was presumed before World War I and II. And during the time of the Great Wars, universities were largely concerned with the sciences to support the war effort. However, after World War II, many academics and funding was opened back up for research into the ancient cults. What we now understand about these cults is less certain than previously presented, and that they are all very different from each other. We call them the mystery cult because it is a mystery what went on in their rites. It is a mystery, hence a mystery cult. That is why we call them that, and there is nothing deeper than that. We know a great deal more about these groups today than we did a century ago, and what we know from archaeology has yielded many things that do appear to resemble something like Freemasonry, but just as much is totally different. I think of Nietzsche's example of a lightning strike from On the Genealogy of Morals. It is two worlds, but one thing. Nietzsche uses this to illustrate how language plays tricks on us. We take two words of lightning strike to presume that the doer does the doing. But really, a lightning strike is simply one thing, an action, a doing, and we let our language trick us into viewing this term otherwise. This sort of trick that language plays on us, I think, is being played on us when we use the term religion. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Roman paganism, indigenous American religions, Satanism, and the rest are all examples of what we call religion. But are they? They are very different things, and there is no solid definition of religion that totally encapsulates these religions. Satanists do not believe in God. Taoism does not necessarily believe in the personification of deity, but more of an all-pervading energy or animus that endows the nature of all things. Is belief in a god or gods necessary to be a religion? Buddhists do not necessarily believe this world is real, but an illusion we have created for ourselves, and that we must escape by extinguishing our being, nirvana. What even is religion? It is complicated, and the more we truly survey the different examples of religion, the more we may begin to ask ourselves, are all these examples of religion, or are they all different things that we only have one word to describe them? This is what Nietzsche is saying with the lightning strike. Do not let language play tricks on you. Our who science is still, in spite of all its coldness, of all its freedom from passion, a dupe of the tricks of language. Thus spake Nietzsche. Mystery cults, their artifacts, symbols, and the vague descriptions that survive of their rites and the rest make this problem so much worse. Because herein we have entered the same problem of language tricking us, but the language is not a simple signified-signifier relationship, but something much more vague and open to interpretation. Symbols, allegory, myth, and legend. Lightning is a signifier for a very specific idea, the signified idea of lightning. And a strike is another signifier for another very specific idea, that of striking. But introduce a symbol like a point within a circle and we open up a world of complex and interrelating and differing ideas represented in an image that acknowledges that these ideas can be fully expressed in a single sign. Let us quickly recap the conceptions of symbols as being used here and previously explored in the first post of the series, What Even Are Symbols? Published on this blog on December 20th, 2023. I believe Jean Baudrillard best understood the use and conception of symbols, namely, that they are a system of signs and signifiers, but that they deny that the complete totality of all of it expresses can be represented in an image. This is unlike a simulacrum, a copy of something, such as a portrait of a person. We know it is not that person, but a good representation of their likeness. A symbol, on the other hand, essentially denies that the entire reality of something can be fully represented and thus denies reality and creates a sign to stand in for a reality that cannot be represented. If that seems vague, you are on the right page, because symbols are vague and multifaceted. They are not as simple as a nice portrait of a famous person. You do not look at a portrait of George Washington and say to yourself, well, the complexity of his life and beliefs are so grand and magnanimous that this cannot be a portrait of George Washington. But if you show the image of a point within a circle and someone says that is the symbol for the sun, they will be immediately met by numerous voices declaring other things like the duad, the image of unity, the first principle of Euclidean geometry, and the rest. Symbols tend to be so vague and multifaceted that they become much more open to interpretation and speculation than, say, what the words lightning strike mean. There is the notion of omnism, or religious pluralism, or that all religions are essentially true and can be respected. Yet we know that Hinduism and Taoism and Christianity and Islam and the rest are not the same thing. Personally, I believe that God speaks more than one language and therefore speaks more than one religion. Yet these religions are not inherently the same thing, and they differ greatly sometimes, not resembling each other in any way whatsoever. In fact, some religions are so different it's hard to comprehend that they can essentially be the same thing. Thus, why would we expect anything different in the ancient world? The cult of Isis was a Greco-Roman cult that appropriated an Egyptian goddess into a Roman cult via Greece. The cult at Samothrace is a chthonic religion cult, similar to the cult at Lemnos, but essentially different and probably both rooted in some Neo-Hittite cult. These differ from the numerous cults of Mithras, a vast number of different civic associations of Roman soldiers that worshipped the Romanization of a minor Persian god Mithras. These differ still from the various cults of Jesus Christ. When talking about the different forms of Christianity in the early centuries, we will call unorthodox cults as being heresy, coming from the Latin heresies, literally meaning choice of belief. These Christian cults can be very wild, such as the various Gnostic sects, which were not a singular Christian movement, but rather a catch-all category of Christian heretics. Let us clear something up before proceeding. When I say cult, I do not mean it in its current derogatory conception, but rather the sociological conception of a religious group that is very new, in which the vast majority of its members were not born into the religious group. The group is usually formed in protest of a particular institutional religion, and then as more members join it, it becomes a cult. And as more people are born into the cult, it becomes a denomination of an institutional religion. See the work of Howard P. Becker. Understanding how cults arise, how different religions can be, and questioning whether or not these are all religions, or if we have no other word to describe all these different spiritual movements, we return to how Masons can presume all these different cults can be the same thing, of which Freemasonry is an inheritor thereof. When dealing with the complex and vague language of symbols which do not establish a particular reality but rather deny reality, we can read whatever we want into them. This is why we can find anything from any mystery cult of the ancient world and point to it saying, "That's Masonic." But is it? I believe the cults of Mithras are the best case study for this phenomenon. The reason is that the Mithraic cults are the mystery cults of the ancient world that we know most about. St. Jerome, Porphyry, Origen, and others write about this cult. We have graffiti and sculptural representations of their rites and myth cycle. Of all the ancient mystery cults, the cults of Mithras are the ones that we know the most about. Contrast this to the cult of Eleusis, in which the best we can describe their rites is that there were things done, things shown, and things said. That is like super duper clear. Thanks, archaeologists. The great central image of the Mithraic cults, the Tauroctony, is probably one of the best examples. This image depicts Mithras slaying the bull. Here Mithras represents the sun conquering the dark, the bull's crescent horns being associated with the moon. Flanking each side of this scene are two figures, Cottus and Cotoplates, the former with a raised torch and the other with a lower torch, representing the winter and summer solstices respectively. They represent the extremes of the sun being low and cold and being high and hot, but Mithras is in the middle, representing balance between the extremes. For more on the astrological interpretation of this image, I recommend the works of the Mithraic scholar Roger Beck. If an interpretation of that image sounds familiar to something in Masonry, you are on the right page. This is the interpretation of the circumpunct bounded by two perpendicular parallel lines. The point within the circle is the classic symbol of the sun, where the parallel lines represent the holy Saints John, who represent the extremes of the summer and winter solstices, and that we should seek a balance between. So do we presume the Mithraic cults are a precursor to Freemasonry? I do not see how we could. The cult of Mithras were stomped out by Theodosius in the 4th century. The European economy would not become sophisticated enough to support the guild system until the 9th and 10th centuries, and even then, we do not see the earliest stonemason guilds until the 11th century. How could there be a connection over a 700-year gap? Esoteric speculations on these groups hiding out in secret are more on brand for conspiracy theorists than anything academically tenable. But the similarity of the symbols of the Tauroctony and the circumpunct is quite strong, and I will admit that they are strikingly similar, if not astoundingly similar in conception and interpretation. However, we are letting the language of symbols cloud our judgment when we presume that just because two different groups thought up the same thing, then they must be linked, when in fact there is no solid or even flimsy evidence to support such. Years ago, I gave a lecture at a Masonic symposium on the subject of the similarities between the cults of Mithras and Freemasonry, and I prefaced the talk with the firm assertion that there is no link between the two. They have a lot of similarities, but just as many differences. To illustrate my point of how two cultures can have something very similar and be so remote in time and geography that there is no way to connect the two, I used the example of the Yggdrasil and the contemporary Navajo sand painting The Healing Way, both of which have striking similarities. They have 3 roots, 3 levels, 3 branches or ears of corn, a rainbow bridge, and a bird on top. However, the Norse could not have had any contact with the Navajo. That is preposterous. Yet several Masons in the room started speculating how Vikings could have come across the Atlantic and transmitted across indigenous American tribes to eventually get the American Southwest. And I just put my face in my hands. I was just trying to illustrate how crazy it would be to presume that there could be a link between the two groups, and here you all are, trying to connect them. If even simple language can deceive us, then symbols are like a trickster god. Symbols as a language are the chief deceivers of esoteric exploration. When we find 2 or more similar symbols, we are compelled to find links, even making up links, to try and force a connection that isn't there. It is fun to explore such things, and even enjoyable to speculate, but at the end of the day, we need to reel ourselves back in and consider the reality of a reasonable connection, or just wishful thinking. Seeker beware. Patrick Day. Patrick Day is past master of Nevada Lodge No. 4 in the ghost town of Nevadaville, Colorado. Currently serves as their secretary and is also past master of the Research Lodge of Colorado, as many other titles. Worshipful Brother Day also, of course, does our Masonic Mythbusters segments, which we greatly appreciate. And parts of this probably sound familiar from one that he did a while back. Something recently that came to mind as I was reading a lot about these different things was this idea of wishful thinking that Patrick mentions. When we think about, we just want there to be some sort of a wild mystery as part of something that we are a part of, namely Masonry. And I think Masonry by itself is good enough, although there always is a little bit of excitement when we find out something really cool and then we dig in and then there's disappointment, right? Unless we're just so incredibly invested in this idea that we just can't let it go. Such might be the cases with various, somewhat popular Masons out there who have different venues of putting their ideas out into the public sphere. Something that struck me just recently was an article that I was reading, and then I followed it up with a bunch of comprising other writings and academic pieces, as well as some YouTube videos by some interesting and accredited scholars on the topic who deal with things like Lemuria and Atlantean origins and these kinds of things, and their basis in almost a sort of Aryan master race cult ideology that once we uncover is very, very troublesome. And I will likely try to compile something along that series for the future because I do think it is interesting, and especially since all of that kind of touches on Masonry in several different organizations, A.E. Waite or the Theosophical Society or many of the eclectic and polymaths of Masonry from the previous centuries had written about these lost lands and mystery cultures that passed on their secret knowledge down through the ages, and that Masonry is somehow a storehouse for some of this information. Very interestingly, has a loose affiliation to what we just read here from Brother Patrick Day. A similar story was when Brother Darren Laners and I did an episode of our podcast, The Fourth Veil, about Admiral Byrd and the claims that he saw or faced some sort of an alien UFO army at Antarctica when he was there, and talked about how these machines could fly across continents in seconds and all of this. And it was so interesting to read the truth about this. But what was more interesting is that it only took about 20 minutes in a Google translation page to figure out the truth and where the mix-up was. And this entire story about UFOs at the South Pole has a complete basis in neo-Nazism, that's right, and a misinterpretation of a South American newspaper, which was mistranslated and printed, and now shows like Ancient Aliens and others, quote this stuff. But if you pull up an image of that original newspaper and just run Google Translate over it, it's a completely different story. And you can get the whole lowdown on that in that particular episode, which is, of course, on the website fourthveil.com. And it's from Season 2, Episode 8, Operation High Jump, The Truth. Darren and I are believers in the extraterrestrial phenomenon, cryptids, and all of those kinds of things. But when the truth can be discerned with very little research, we try to find that and present it, and we did. That episode did not get all the love in the world because we were destroying somebody's preconceived notions of this amazing story that had been purported for many, 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 many years. And aside from the readily available information, quick translations that you can do yourself with Google Translate and the original newspapers, and realizing that the books written on the topic are works of fiction, well, it's pretty easy. So, with all that, I hope you guys had an edifying journey this week as we dove into these two topics. One more thanks goes out to our producers, fellows, contributors, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. You're the reason behind this show, listener-supported Masonic education. We've been doing the show since, 12 years or something, maybe 13, 2011. Anyway, it's been a long time, and we can't do it without you. And if you're out there listening week after week and you're thinking, how can I help? Then head on over to WCYpodcast.com, click on support the show, check it all out. and my thanks in advance for your considerations. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful week. I'll talk to you all next week, and until then, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.
WCY Media.
This is